it has its own internal autonomy, right? Every cell in the body has its own internal process of self-organizing. There's no external cell that reaches in and organizes the cell. So it is a whole autonomous entity, but it's also part of a larger whole or an organ, right? And the organ doesn't boss the cells around, right? And there's no CEO cell telling the others what to do, right? That's the way our companies tend to be organized, but nature organizes differently. It gives autonomy at every level. And yet there is this broader layer. There's an organ that integrates the autonomy of the cells. It doesn't direct them, it doesn't have to. It takes their autonomous functions and it wraps them together into a larger whole autonomous function, which is itself a part of a broader system. So the heart's job is not to tell the blood cells and nerve cells and muscle cells, how to do their job. It's to integrate their functions into the overall heart, which is then a part of a cardiovascular system. So every level is kind of a self-contained, self-organizing system, but also needs to be aligned with a broader whole and in connection with everything around it. That's nature's way of dealing with complexity at scale, right? And oops, sorry. That's the same organizing principle that you'll see in Holacracy and where the root of the word came from as well.
Thanks for that. So walk us through an example. Zappos is obviously the most well-known company, but there have to be a lot of organizations out there that have adopted Holacracy. Walk us through how the different components work autonomously while serving the needs of the entire organization.
Yeah, so here's a real example, a true story from my own company. Holacracy is a role-based system. So the focus is breaking down work into clear roles, and then whoever fills the role gains the autonomy to lead that role. So one of the golden rules of Holacracy is when you fill a role, you have the authority to make any decision or take any action to get the job done, unless there's a rule against it. And this is actually really different than the way most companies work. In most companies, the implicit norm is don't act without permission. And you get permission either by finding a boss up the management hierarchy to sponsor it, or more likely, you get permission in most companies by socializing it. You call a meeting, you talk to everyone on your team, you make sure everyone's bought into what we should do, right? And that's how you get permission to act. With Holacracy, it turns that on its head. When you fill a role, you're kind of like the CEO of that role. You have autocratic authority to lead that role, and you can make any decision in the company or take any action anywhere in the company to get your purpose met, to get your role's purpose expressed, unless there's a rule against it. So if somebody else wants you to slow down to honor something they need, great, we're gonna need some rules, but it's on that person to get the rule put in place. So then the focus is defining those boundaries. Where do we need to slow someone else down so that we get our role integrated? Where do we need to expect something from someone else? So here's an example of how that worked. In my company, one day we had, so I fill a role called spokesperson. It's a role I'm doing right now. My job is to spread Holacracy with the world in this role. It's one of about 30 roles I fill. So Holacracy roles are not your entire job. They're one little function or unit. So I fill my spokesperson role a little bit, 5% of my time or so. And one day, another person I work with who filled our casting agent role, casting agent books me for talks, right? So conferences like Responsive, her job is to sort through all of the invitations we get, and we get a lot, figure out which ones to send me to, which ones not. She negotiates with conference organizers, and she's kind of empowered to do that. And she just runs forward, does her thing, leads her work. And I lead mine, and I go do the things that make sense to me in my spokesperson role. Except one day there's a tension between our two roles. She was negotiating with a conference organizer, building relationships, and sometimes at the end of her process, she'd come to me and say, great, I need you to go here and talk. And I'd look at it, and being empowered in my role, I'd say, no, sorry, wrong audience, or not big enough, or whatever, it's not worth my time. And she feels really disempowered, as you can imagine. She did all this work, she built a relationship, I shoot her down at the end. So here's what actually happened using Holacracy to solve this issue. She goes into the governance meeting of our team, and every team is doing these. And the governance process is about structuring the structure of the team, the policies, rules, the process of the team, the roles. So the governance meeting can update anything in the structure of our team. So she comes to our governance meeting. She's invited because she fills a role on the team. And she proposes a new expectation of my role, right? We both have autonomy to lead our roles, but she needs to expect something from mine. She says, I want to expect that the spokesperson role is accountable for publishing the criteria that you would use to decide whether to accept an engagement or not, right? I want to know the criteria you're using, because if I could see that criteria, I could assess myself early in my process and not get shot down at the end when you refuse to go, right? So she proposes this. The governance meeting takes about 2 minutes to sort through that proposal and add the expectation to my role. So 2 minutes later, there's a process to that. I won't go into now, but 2 minutes later, she has a new expectation on my role, and she's able to turn to me and say, so give me an estimate. When do you think you're going to have that done for me by? Right, so that I can go apply that. And the interesting footnote for the story here is she's our newest hire right out of college at this point. And I'm the founder of the company. You know, and what companies do you know where the newest hire right out of college in 2 minutes can get an expectation added onto the founder and then turn to him and say, so when are you going to have that done for me by? Right? And there was no egos, there was no politics involved, there was no status involved. It wasn't about that. It was about her role, casting agent, needed something from my role, spokesperson, and we have a process to update the expectations between us while still leaving us each the power to go lead our roles. So we each have the autonomy to lead our roles, but when we need something in the connection between them, we have a process to go to sort out what the connection is, what we expect from each other, and who decides what, right? So that's a little example of how it works. Now, fast forward, right? Imagine that's happening in every team for every little tension that comes up constantly. So instead of just, in most companies, you're stuck with the tensions you feel. Like in most companies, if you have some tension about the way the company, budgets or hires or fires or, markets or sells or whatever it is the company does, what do you do with those tensions to drive meaningful change? And at best, in most companies, you call a lot of meetings, you talk about it forever, and maybe something shifts eventually. Holacracy's goal is not to give you the right answer to that process. It's not a one-size-fits-all, here's what your company should look like. It gives you the meta process or the framework that allows you to drive rapid change, that allows you to say, cool, take any tension you've got, go into this governance process, and propose a change to the way the team works together. Right? And fast forward over many iterations, over every meeting that this is happening in, and you start getting this company that is evolving, that's living, that's breathing. And the expectations are getting clearer and clearer. The boundaries between roles are getting clearer. And the ability to each go lead our roles outside of the meeting is getting higher. So you have more autocratic decision making. But within the bounds of everyone knows, here's my decision and here are the boundaries of it. So I don't need to call a big meeting. I can just go lead my role. Anyway, I hope that gives a flavor or a taste.
That was well put. I have a question from Rob, which I'm going to defer and get to a little bit later. Listening to you, there's a whole series of questions that arise. And one of them is, where do strategic initiatives arise in this type of system? In more traditional organizations, there are people who have their pulse on the market, people who have pulse on finance, and they create the strategic initiatives. How does that work in Holacracy?
Yeah, so one of the things about Holacracy, it's very intentionally not trying to tell you, here's how any given process should work in your organization. It's trying to give you the meta process to figure that out. So do you have a tension about the way strategic initiatives work? Great, go propose some solution in the governance process. Do you think one role should have all the power to just dictate the strategic priorities and everyone else should align with it? Fine, go propose that. Or do you think we should use some kind of collaborative group process to come up with strategic initiatives and then expect everyone to align with them? Cool, go propose that, right? The goal of Holacracy is not to give you the perfect answer for anything. It's to give you the process to learn together and to find better answers over time. And that includes with ways strategic initiatives work. If you want to centralize control in one person, fine. If you want to break it out and decentralize it in some other way, fine. And I don't think there is one right answer to that. I think different companies need different things. My own bias is towards how much can you decentralize, while still having alignment. But if you're in a company and you're building airplanes and you have to invest millions and millions and millions of dollars on a design that needs 10 years to get approved, maybe you need a very different strategic planning approach than my little nimble training consulting company does. Holacracy works for either. It just adapts it to your environment.
Does this work in any size company, or are there a certain critical mass number of people that need to be involved for this to work? And at a point, or is a company too large to consider this?
So, I usually say the smallest practical size is 3 people, because, if you have 1 person, you really don't need this. And 2 people, it just kind of feels silly when you can just talk to each other and figure it out. That said, a friend of mine runs a company with her spouse, and they tell me that actually it's really critical because it keeps a lot of their own personal issues have a process to go to instead of just going to consensus. So I guess it can work in 2-people businesses, but I think practically speaking 3. And there are plenty of 3-person or 5-person or 10-person companies that are doing Holacracy and loving it for that size. At the upper end, I don't know. The largest companies doing it today are somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 employees. There are bigger companies doing it at a department level, but only in a smaller department, hundreds of people, not thousands. Will it scale beyond a 2,000-person company? I suspect so, but I can't tell you that from real experience yet.
What is the largest company utilizing Holacracy?
There's a couple of them. Zappos is one. There's a bank in Russia. They're not as far along as Zappos is, but they're similar size, or at least in the same ballpark. And then there's one other, and I forget what they are right now, but there's 3 that I know of that are in that kind of size range.
Okay. I'm going to interject a question here. How is Holacracy similar or different than the chaotic approach?
Actually, I had a really cool dialogue with somebody that was worked with Dee Hock, who started the chaotic approach, the guy that built Visa. She was like Dee's like kind of right-hand person. And when she first learned Holacracy, she said, wow, what this does is take the principles that Dee articulated in chaotic organizations, and it puts it into a really concrete practice that makes it simple to apply. So I'd say it's bringing the principles of chaotic into a different practice to embody them. And one of the things that struck her is the way Dee had articulated a lot of the practices. They worked at scale, but they had a lot of overhead and cost to them. And her take was Holacracy brings that overhead way down, so it's much more practical at a much smaller scale, and it brings it into more parts. It's not just the whole company adapting in a big way, it's every little part in this rapid chaotic design process on every team. But if you're familiar with the principles of chaotic organizations, you're going to see the same principles in Holacracy. It's just in a different practice.
I have some questions about the people side of this. In my experience in many organizations, more traditional organizations, even organizations that attempt to be more responsive, people are afraid to make mistakes. So they often tend to, that social process you described, they want other people to embrace it. They want other people to support them. How, in your experience, have companies that are using Holacracy overcome that hesitancy?
There's a massive cultural change needed to make this work, and it's really hard. I mean, don't underestimate the scope of what you're changing here culturally. It's huge. It's to have people go from trying to get consensus and buy-in and prevent any tension from showing up and get the perfect decisions up front, which is the way people tend to work in a lot of companies today, to being this iterative, adaptive thing where the mindset shifts to, I'm just going to lead my role. I'm not going to try to prevent tensions from others. I'm going to get so good at adapting and learning from tension that I don't need to prevent most tensions because there are opportunities to learn and they tell us exactly what we need to change or adapt. So the cultural change there is just huge. This is at least a 5-year journey for people to really internalize the cultural change we're making. And it shows up in every aspect of how we lead, how we follow, how we hold people accountable, and what that even means. This is a massive shift. So the beginning of adopt the Holacracy practices, that's the beginning of the journey. You've got the hard change processes ahead of you at that point. I mean, there's much I can say about how we support that. There's new habits to build, and I think focusing on building micro habits is a really helpful way to do it. But yeah, it's a massive change.
Let's go back to the word you just used, the accountability. And every conversation I have with leaders in organizations, the term accountability comes up. It seems to be the nightmare managers wish they could have an answer to. As I follow the structure and the concept of holacracy, you clearly assign accountability. And what happens when people don't follow through? What's the mechanism for people who are hesitant to go to a coworker and say, hey, you promised you would have this and you didn't?
Yeah.
If you didn't respond to the person that was holding you on track to come up with the parameters, there's some thoughts and suggestions on how all of that works and how companies can utilize this?
Yeah, I find it fascinating. This is one of the most common questions I get. I think that says something about what happens in modern companies, or at least the mindset of what we worry about, performance problems. The irony is, when Holacracy is put in place and people run into those issues, I'd say 9 times out of 10, the issue isn't a performance issue with somebody else. It's actually a clarity issue. And the first thing Holacracy does is force you to differentiate between them. Often, when I'll use myself as an example, when my gut is somebody did something wrong, right? Or somebody made a bad decision, or they didn't do something they really should have, right? When I have those shoulds, the first thing Holacracy does is force me to look in a mirror and ask, is the expectation I'm holding explicit or implicit, right? Because if it's implicit, which I find it often is in those cases, it may be that the other person simply has a different idea of what I should be expecting from them, right? And often our implicit expectations feel so reasonable to us and not as reasonable to the other person, right? It's obvious to us, of course, this person should be doing things this way or doing this thing or whatever, but from their side, they have different context, different perspective. It often looks different. So the first thing Holacracy does is force us to align expectations and make the implicit explicit. I have no right to expect something unless it's an explicit expectation. So this does a really magical thing with blame. When somebody shows up in a meeting and they're clearly leaking some judgment or blame about someone else, the first thing it does is hold up a mirror to that and say, let's look at the explicit expectations. Is this in there? And 9 times out of 10, when people are new to this, it's not. And what that does is tell the person with the expectation, you have no right to expect them to do that. So everything you're judging them for is actually about you needing to get clarity, not about their performance. The first step is get clarity. And that's what the governance process does in Holacracy. Forces us to get clarity. Now, once we have clarity that yes, this clearly is an expectation, now we open up all these avenues that we can pursue when it really still doesn't happen, which sometimes it doesn't. But again, most of these issues are not real performance issues, they're clarity issues. Once you get that clarity, that solves 90% of the stuff that I otherwise see coming up. And when you still have some left, it then forces you to ask really good questions like, why not? Why didn't that get done? Sometimes it's a priority issue, right? So this is the other thing. I can't expect anyone to do something on my priority schedule, but we can have a conscious discussion about the different priorities. And then if we have different ideas of what's important, there's another process to align those. So sometimes it's the person agrees with me. Yes, that is something that should be done, but it's not the most important thing on my plate, right? And sometimes that's what comes up. When I say, why haven't you done this? They say, it's on my list. It's just not the most important thing I'm working on. And now we have to have a meaningful conversation about what's more important for the business. Is it the thing you're working on or the thing I want you to do, right? And that's a really healthy conversation to have. And then there's a process to get alignment if we actually disagree. Sometimes just the conversation gets us to alignment and there isn't even a question of disagree. But if we do, then there's another process that gets clear what's more important to the overall team, not just to each of our individual roles. So that's just one scenario. Sometimes what you realize is the person tried their best and they're a bad fit in the role. And you still need someone else who can remove somebody from a role, or a process that can remove somebody from a role. Sometimes people really do need to get kicked out of a role. And that doesn't have to be a big deal if they fill 10 other roles. Sometimes when I get fired from a role, I'm grateful. It just frees me up to go do my 20 some other roles, right? So, all of these are scenarios, but we try to lump performance issues as if they're one thing, and they're not. They could be a clarity issue. That's often the case. Once you solve that, it could be a priority issue. It could be an actual performance issue if somebody doesn't have the skills, right? It could be a visibility issue, a transparency issue. Sometimes it's that. So there's so many scenarios. Holacracy doesn't have a one magic answer. It just forces you to ask the right questions so that you can figure out where to go with it.
Listening to you, I understand why you say it's a 5-year process to implement. These are pretty radical changes in the way most organizations think. In your experience, does compensation and ownership of a company change? Very different for somebody investing all of this time and energy if they're an hourly employee than somebody who's on profit sharing and what else?
Yeah, so as far as equity ownership goes, Holacracy is neutral on that. It doesn't force you to change it, and you might choose to. It's independent. You can use Holacracy when the ownership is entirely centralized, and you can use Holacracy in a totally distributed employee-owned organization or whatever. As far as compensation, it often needs to shift, at least in the process of it. If your process is the boss decides the pay and you adopt Holacracy and no longer have bosses, you need to find something to replace it, right? So there's no one size fits all. Holacracy doesn't say, here's how you have to pay people. Again, it just adds the meta process so that you can evolve how you pay people. And then companies find all sorts of really creative ways to do it, but they still do tend to have differentiation. I mean, some people bring more skills, more experience, better judgment, and those people tend to get paid more, and Holacracy doesn't change that. But it does change maybe how you go about recognizing what the contributions are. And it does invite people to take more ownership for sure, but that doesn't have to tie to compensation. I know plenty of minimum wage employees that would love to have a job that actually gave them more autonomy to actually contribute in meaningful ways to what they do. I mean, just because somebody is paid less doesn't mean that, they don't want to actually do good work and contribute, So I think that's really an independent thing. Holacracy certainly invites people to take more autonomy and contribution. And then you can find whatever compensation system makes sense to your business.
There are a number of questions, and I'm going to work through some of these from participants. One of them is, in your experience, in some of the responsive conversations, there's this question of how do we get upper level management to buy into these changes? Is this something in your experience that upper level management absolutely has to embrace, or have you seen examples where people from a lower position sort of introduce some of these concepts?
So it's a tough one. If you don't get not just upper management, CEO level buy-in, you are not going to get an organization-wide Holacracy adoption. That said, what you could do is adopt it in one team or one department. As long as you have the lead of that department or team needs to have the authority to say, I'm going to run this department my way, and as long as I get the results the rest of the company needs or whatever, I have the potential to do that. Then you can have it adopted at one team or department. That can work. It's harder, but there are many successful cases in bigger companies where a department head said, I'm adopting this. Sometimes without any buy-in at all. Sometimes they didn't even tell the upper management. They just said, yeah, we're just experimenting with some, more clear ways to describe our work internally. Don't worry about it, And other times they do get them involved. That said, that's vulnerable. We had a team at Google, a department that adopted Holacracy at that level. Didn't get upper management all that involved. And it was going well. They were learning, they were adopting until upper management did a reorg, split the department in two, brought in 2 new leaders. The new leaders came in and said, what's this thing? Yeah, we don't need it, and threw it right out. And Holacracy was dead, right? Nothing to do with Holacracy. But that's some of the vulnerability. The other issue they had was they were bound by HR policies that actually worked against what Holacracy was trying to do. And they didn't have the autonomy to change those at their team. So they worked around them as best they could. And I've seen those approaches work. There's even departments in government agencies that have adopted Holacracy in an environment that is about as hostile to it as you can imagine. But it's really hard. And don't underestimate the challenge. Get a good coach if you can, at least get training. It's a really, really big challenge.
So follow-up question from a member of the audience is, if a team or a department wants to introduce it and they don't really want to be on the radar, you have some suggestions on how they introduce it without using the term Holacracy?
Don't try or set up to fail. You've got to be able to talk about it. You've got to be able to say, here is the new framework we're doing. Just trying to kind of do it without talking about it misses the point. The point is an authority shift. What you're doing when you adopt Holacracy is saying the old management hierarchy or our part in it no longer has the authority to direct people's actions or even to define what people should do. Instead, we're putting the authority to define roles into a governance process. And that's defined actually in a constitution. There's an open source constitution document that companies use. It defines the governance process. You're putting authority from management hierarchy into constitution, which then empowers the governance process, which then empowers your roles and says, when you have a role, you have the freedom to act, and there is no boss who can tell you otherwise. And if you try to do it without actually talking about it, right, you don't get that shift. You may have more efficient meetings, and if that's what you want, go for it. Adopt some of the meeting processes, but don't expect transformation. Instead, you can do it in a team, but find the department heads or the team leads, somebody that gets it, that you can talk to, and that in that department or team can say, we are making a change as of this date. We are no longer looking to bosses to direct work. We are in a self-managed framework with this constitutional rule set. I have never seen it work to try to do it without talking about it and try to kind of build up to it by a piece at a time. It's like trying to sneakily play soccer without telling people we're playing soccer. Like, I mean, you start kicking a ball down a field, you're not playing soccer. You're playing soccer when everyone playing says, we're playing by these rules, right? And we're not just gonna pick up the ball and walk off when we want to. We're playing by this rule structure. And you can't really do it part of the rules or you're not really playing the game. You need to say, as of this time, we're entering this new game, we're playing by these rules. You can do that in part of the company, but you really need to do that or you're really not going to get there in all likelihood from what I've seen.
How does HR role shift when a company goes utilizing Holacracy, either as an entire company or a division?
It depends. So part of the function that's typically HR gets distributed and every team ends up doing some of the functions. Like a lot of the teams are locally adapting a lot of their own policies that would otherwise be set by HR. So some of it gets decentralized. Some of it's still needed. Like you still need a compensation system. You still need a hiring process and a firing process. But those probably need to evolve. So often the work of HR becomes much less working within the existing system. And now how do we innovate and pioneer a compensation system and a firing system that works with the new reality of not having a single point of boss that can direct the action, right? So there's an experimentation that starts happening in often what was the HR functions. And that can get really interesting. Like my company, we have a way of firing people that I can genuinely tell you, I love the way we fire people. It's human, it's respectful, it's honoring. I love it. And it took us 7 years to evolve it and to get to where it is. And that's because instead of looking at HR and accepting all of the kind of default ways we do things in management hierarchy, we had to get creative. We have no managers. And we did get creative and we tried some stuff. And at first, it caused a lot of tension. We fired somebody and it sucked. And then somebody came and said, that sucked. And here's an idea for how to do it a little better. And they proposed a change in our governance process. And it got a little better. And we fired somebody else and it still sucked, but less. And we proposed another change and another change and another. And after a few years of iteration, we had a really cool way to do that. And that's the work of HR then. It's iterating on some of those core people processes to make them better and better and better without relying on a single point of failure in the form of a manager, because you don't have it anymore.
So how do you fire people now?
So one thing I want to say is this is my company's approach to doing this. It's not built into Holacracy. Holacracy is not telling you here's how to fire people. It's telling you here's the meta process so that you can evolve your own firing process, right? So just with that framing aside, that said, the cool thing is a number of companies have copied my company's approach. The other thing you can do with Holacracy, you can take any one company's approach that they publish and just say, we're going to start with that, and then we're going to fork it. It's like open source organization, and start iterating our own direction from there. So my company's approach, anyone in the company can call for a review of anyone else in the company. And in this partnership review, we call it, we have a group of 6 people that fill a role for partnership assessor. In addition to those 6, the person in question can invite somebody else to join that group if they know someone has more information about them or whatever. And then we ask a question, and we all 6 answer that question simultaneously. And the question isn't, should we fire the person? We learned early on that when that's the question, it invites all sorts of emotions and all this other stuff to get in the way. It's a hard question. So we ask a different question. We say, if this person didn't work here and they were applying, they were interested, and you knew everything about them that you knew already, but they didn't already work here, would you advocate for hiring them again? Or would you advocate against hiring them again? Or do you have no strong feelings, neutral? And we all 6 simultaneously say, yeah, I'd advocate for hiring them, against, or neutral. And at the end of the process, if you need at least one advocate. If everyone's neutral, that's a fire result, which is an interesting thing. That stops people from sticking around that are really not, they're not underwhelming, but they're not overwhelming. They're just kind of whelming, right? And you need more people advocating for than against. But the cool thing I love about this, if the result comes back negative, it would be a fire, we don't immediately enact it. We tell the person the result, and we give them a couple of weeks to talk to everyone involved in the process in any way they choose. And they can also offer new agreements to the company, things they're going to change or do differently or whatever. And if they request it, we will throw out that result and redo the entire process after they have those conversations, which leaves them a lot of power to navigate that, get data, talk, but they have to drive it. No one else is driving it for them. If they do nothing, that result is enacted. If they do engage and they request throwing it out and redoing it, we'll do that, and we'll do it again. And we've had people go through that process and choose not to ask us to do it again, but then they feel more empowered in leaving. They say, you know what? After talking to people, I think this is the right answer for me too. Thank you for helping me get to somewhere I can add more value. We've had people who do request it happen again and then stay with the company, get a positive result, and have a great relationship. We've had people fired who came back and became our customers through it, or stayed really close friends with the people involved in the process. So, that's the way we've evolved it. And the point isn't that specific process to me. It's by iterating on our process without being able to just fall back on the crutch of the manager will figure it out. We've evolved a process that it just feels so human. It works so well for the company too. It gets rid of people faster than it ever did before, but more respectfully as well. Anyway, that's just an example, but imagine that in every process, not just firing. Every single little micro process in your company is evolving like that.
That's brilliant. I'm going to share that. I love that approach. There are a whole series of questions that all revolve around this topic of what happens when people disagree. You don't make decisions based on consensus. What if somebody suggests your role change or your responsibilities change and you disagree? How are disagreements handled?
Yeah, so it depends at what level. Let's start with operational disagreements. And I'm making the distinction between governance disagreements. Governance is about the structure of who makes what decisions, what are the policies. That's the stuff that happens in the governance process. Then there's operational issues, which are the specific decisions. So for example, in my company, we do a lot of Holacracy trainings. We have a role we created in our governance process that decides what new markets should we bring our trainings to. We have another role that decides what hotel do we use for our trainings. Those specific decisions don't happen in a meeting. They happen outside of the meeting. The governance process is never used to decide, let's do our next training in Austin and let's do it at the Hilton. The governance process is only used to decide, okay, we need a role training business that decides what markets, what cities to open trainings in, and another role, venue selector, that decides what venues. And we set up expectations with that. The venue selector role has to choose a venue that meets the requirements that the trainer has. Still up to them which one, but there's a constraint. So that's what governance is doing. It's never making the decisions, it's setting up the structure. We're working on the business, not in it, in governance. So in the operational realm, what specific city, what specific hotel, in that realm, disagreements are really clear because you know who makes the decision, right? Our venue selector decides what venues within the expectation that they have to align with trainers' requirements. In that realm, if somebody has an opinion, they can pitch the person filling that role, but that person has autocratic authority to decide how much input they want to get, how much input to integrate, and when to call it and say, I've got enough input, we just need to lead this, I'm going to make a decision. Now that said, if somebody feels like they're missing something, they can go to governance and set up the structure, but they're not challenging the decision. So for example, at one point in time, we didn't have the constraint that that venue selector needed to honor the trainer's requirements. And we had a training that was in a hotel that really wasn't a great training environment many, many years ago. And so in our trainer role, I brought that tension to governance and I said, look, in this process, I can't tell the venue person that I want to have consensus with them in every training. That would be insane. I don't want to get involved, but I want to know that this criteria are going to be met. So we added that constraint. If the disagreement is about the governance, then there's a process to hold and integrate. So operational decisions are mostly autocratic. You know who leads and you know within what constraints. But in governance, we have a highly integrative process. And the decision there, it's not a consensus-based process. We're never asking everyone, do you agree? Right? Do you think this is the right answer, the right solution? We're asking, do you see any reasons that adopting this person's proposal will cause harm in your ability to get your work done? Right? If everyone says no, it's just adopted. When somebody brings a proposal to governance, if no one says, here's how that will get in the way of me getting my work done, it's adopted. Doesn't matter if everyone thinks it's a bad idea. All that stops it is if somebody can say, here's a tangible reason why that proposal will make my work harder. And if somebody does have one of those, that doesn't stop it, it just gives us a puzzle to solve. And there's a process for that to say, how can we solve this person's need without getting in the way of this other role getting their work done effectively? And there's a process for that. I can't go into the process in depth here, but if you want to see it, there's a video on our website that will go in more depth and kind of walk you through how that process does that integration. So in this way, it's interesting. Holacracy is both highly integrative and highly autocratic, right? But it's not consensus driven. The integrative portion in governance, it's not asking everyone to agree. It's making sure all concerns are addressed, right? It's making sure if there's something in the way of your work, that gets in, but only at the governance level. And then it leaves people a lot of autocratic decision making, but everyone knows who makes which autocratic decision. And it's much like society where, you know, if it's my house, I have autocratic decision making over my house. I don't need to call a meeting of the neighborhood to redecorate my kitchen. It's my kitchen and I know I'm in charge of leading it. I can get input from my neighbor. If my neighbor happens to have a good perspective on interior design, I can ask my girlfriend what she thinks, but if it's my house, it's my decision. Right? And yet then we have these boundaries between us. Where's the property line between my house and my neighbors? In organizations, it's not always really clear. And that's what the governance process sorts out. Where are the boundaries between who makes which decisions? And what do we need to expect from each other? So that's what governance does. And that's a highly collaborative, highly integrative process. So it kind of gets you, I think, the best of both worlds. Rapid, fast, autocratic decision-making within a highly integrated process that makes sure the boundaries are right on who decides what.
Presumably, the business journals are filled with case studies of colossally bad mistakes or bad decisions certain corporations and organizations and managers lead. Presumably in Holacracy, those get corrected retroactively. somebody makes a purchasing decision, it's a disaster. You change the processes, you change the governance, and maybe you have 3 people have to sign off on it or something of that nature. So that's part of the iterative process, correct?
Yeah, and I should say there are some decisions that you really want to prevent any tension in advance. And for those, set up the governance you want in advance to make sure you don't make a bad decision as best you can. Holacracy won't guarantee you don't make bad decisions, but it does harness the wisdom. But that's a minority, right? Most decisions, I think, are exactly what you're describing. You try it, you make some mistakes, you learn from them, and that's actually way more effective overall than trying to prevent all mistakes. Most mistakes are much more cost effective to learn from than to prevent upfront, but not all.
Okay, and there's a question about how does this system prevent a very aggressive or energetic person from taking on too many roles?
It doesn't. You know, somebody can take on too many roles and burn themselves out. I've seen that happen. And in which case, if that happened, would you feel any tension about it? Again, Holacracy's goal is not to prevent tension. It's to make sure if you feel some tension, you can go learn from it with your team. So maybe you need a constraint on how much people can overload themselves with roles. Go propose it in the governance process, right? To me, that's the beauty of this. It's not trying to be perfect. It's not trying to say, let's make sure anything that could go wrong does. It's saying, look, you're going to do the best you can, and then you're going to learn from it. So let's get the process right to learn. That's more important than the process to try to prevent anything like that from happening. You know, sometimes you get too many policies. Great, someone has tension about it, and you go remove some or simplify them. Sometimes you get too few roles, you propose new ones. Too many roles, you propose less. The point isn't get it right up front. The point is learn and evolve and respond and adapt to all of the wisdom coming up over time.
Hopefully, some of what you're describing has sparked people's thinking about, gee, I would like to implement some of these approaches. We're not ready for a full-scale conversion. If people want to learn more about some of the guiding principles, if they want to incorporate some but not all of this, in addition, you have a website clearly and a book and things of this nature. Where would you direct people for follow-up conversations, for self-learning?
Yeah, so the website is a great starting point. There's a lot of materials and resources on there. My book, you mentioned, also really good to learn more. But the challenge with both of those, this is a practice. It's like trying to learn a music instrument by reading about it, right? To some extent, you just need to sit down and play it, or ideally with somebody that knows what they're doing and can show you the ropes. So it's the kind of thing that the best learning is hands-on, and not hands-on alone unless you're with somebody that's done it before, or you're going to be practicing the wrong thing and not know it. So get to some kind of live demo. You can do that by finding a company that's doing it and going, some companies give tours and let you watch them do some of these processes. Or go to one of our trainings, or we have a network of licensed Holacracy coaches all over the world that put on workshops and trainings and give people tastes of it. Right. You can also bring a coach into your organization to give you a little experience of it on your real issues and your real team. We do a lot of that kind of thing. So get a hands-on experience. You can reach out to us and we can either help you ourselves or put you in touch with one of our network coaches. There's nothing like learning this by really experiencing it, especially if you think you want to adopt part of it. It's like saying you want to adopt part of soccer. There are some things you can do. You can have fun kicking a ball around, but you can also end up concluding this is a stupid game if you don't adopt the right rules together. So it's really, really challenging. The best thing you can do is get an overall experience of the whole thing, and then you'll figure out if there are some key principles you can use, but you need to experience it as a whole, even if it's just temporary in a little training bubble or something, to really know what you're doing with adopting part of it.
And the URL for people to learn more is?
It's holacracy.org, but people misspell it all the time. It's not H-O-L-O. Don't do that. It's Holacracy. Here, I just typed a link in to the chat for you. Holacracy.
Okay, you got it. Do you have any experience with nonprofits adopting Holacracy?
Yeah, Holacracy is a purpose-driven system. So whether you're for-profit or non, the focus is aligning with purpose. There are a lot of nonprofits, even some government agencies doing it now, specifically because they're already purpose-driven in that sector typically, right? Nonprofits especially have a mission, a purpose they're trying to serve, but often they have some struggles with the operational discipline around how do we organize concretely around that purpose. And that's really where Holacracy shines. It gives you a purpose-driven structure to break overall purpose down into every single little role and then learn and evolve how do we better express our purpose. Everything comes back to that. So it's ideal for that sector. And we have a lot of organizations in nonprofit land doing it.
And that would work, as you mentioned earlier, for small or large organizations.
Absolutely.
No particular minimum, and most nonprofits aren't 1,500 to 2,000 people strong.
No.
We have a number of coaches and consultants if they want to learn more in terms of when they, not to be a bona fide Holacracy coach or something, but if they want to learn more, are there trainings that people could learn more about basic principles and how they might introduce these concepts?
Yeah, I'd say a good quarter to a third of the people that come through our Holacracy practitioner training, which is our 4.5-day deep dive into Holacracy, are coaches and consultants that are exploring it to see what they can learn. Some of them do go on and become actual licensed Holacracy coaches. Others just incorporate different ideas and elements into their other coaching practice. So check that out. You'll see a list of those on the website. It's the same training that's meant for teaching people how to really use it. It's the deep dive into what is this thing and how does it work.
Okay, I'm going to follow up with a couple more questions, but we're running out of time. So this has been brilliant. Appreciate your time here. For those listening in, if you want to learn more about some of the responsive webinars or conferences coming up, you can go to responsive.org and sign up for our newsletter. And presumably people can also go to holacracy.org and sign up for your newsletter as well, Brian?
Yep, absolutely.
And if people have any follow-up questions for you, do you want them to direct them towards you or to somebody else on your team?
You can just go to our website and do contact us, and it'll get routed to the right role filler, depending on what your question is. We have a process for that, imagine that. And you can also post your questions on our community. If you go to our website and click community at the top, it'll take you to we have an online community forums. There's lots of people living Holacracy every day and coaches on there. So that's a great place to post questions to the community as well.
Now, I had hoped to get into your perspective on the future of work, but we're running out of time here. Tell me briefly from your perspective, what type of companies should not consider Holacracy? Where has it not been a really particularly good fit?
Interesting. It's not about industry or type of company or size. It comes down to the leader at the top. That is the single biggest point of failure around this. The person adopting it, typically a CEO, although sometimes a department head or something. That person they need to be ready and willing to learn a new way to lead and committed to that journey. And typically they're people that have a lot of self-awareness, have done a lot of their own internal self-work. They're not just bringing this in as a tool to look for others to change, but they're willing to sign up for their own change process of learning new ways to organize themselves. And they're in it with everyone else with a lot of awareness. Those people that do this successfully are pretty remarkable. And it really, everyone else in the company, they can resist it. But if the person at the top resists it, it gets thrown out really quick. So it's got to be somebody that is on board that, it's all about that to me. Is that leader ready for it? Okay, we're out of time. Any final message you'd like to convey? Appreciate you taking the time and sharing your wisdom and experience. Yeah, just for what I'm inspired just to see so many people now, and this movement has become a hub of it, who are exploring new ways of working and being and living. And to me, like, the inquiry is far more interesting than the answer. So Holacracy may be an answer for now, for a while, but the inquiry is what excites me. So thank you everyone for being part of this inquiry, and wish you luck in your journey, and hope Holacracy can add some value or contribute in some way.
Thanks so much.
Cool.
Robin,
Thanks,
you want to?
Yeah, just thank you again, Brian. Really appreciate you stepping in. And also for folks here, Brian is going to be on our stage in an interview format with Alexis Gonzalez-Black, who rolled out Holacracy at Zappos, or was one of the key figures behind the rollout of Holacracy at Zappos. And that is happening September 13th and 14th on Zappos campus in downtown Las Vegas. So Brian, again, thank you for taking this time, and really excited to welcome you to our stage in September.
Yeah, likewise. Looking forward to it. Thanks, Robin. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Glenn, and everyone for attending. We'll see you again next month.
Bye.
Bye.